Scene 9 crossing the divide, the group emerged from a tangled wall of thickets, stepping onto a bank lined with thick, muddy soil. Ahead of them stretched a wide, sluggish river, its dark surface rippling gently under a humid breeze. The air felt heavier here, thick with the scent of moss and decaying leaves, and the buzzing of unseen insects filled the silences between their steps. Tira squinted, her eyes scanning the opposite bank, hoping to catch a glimpse of something useful, a bridge, a dock, a boat, anything to help them cross. "There's nothing here to get across," Bannock muttered, his tone frustrated but calm, scanning the water's edge with a critical eye. Tira watched the line of faint goblin footprints vanish at the river's edge. Maybe the goblins had a boat? Devon dropped to a crouch, his gaze sharp. "Doubtful. Look here." He gestured to the ground, pointing out faint but distinctive webbed indentations within the tracks. "They're amphibious," they swam. Liz glanced at the footprints with a satisfied look, as if solving this clue was another confirmation of her approach. "Which means they're already on the other side and we're stuck over here," she said, her gaze shifting to the others, lingering on Addie with a hint of impatience. Tira caught a flicker of discomfort in Addie's expression as her friend shifted awkwardly, casting an uneasy look at the water. Addie leaned in close and whispered, "Not really my thing swimming." Bannock's reassuring nod and small understanding smile were quiet gestures of support. "No worries, Addie," he murmured. "We'll figure something out that works for everyone." But Liz was already huddled with Devon and Val, discussing a separate plan, her voice confident and low. "Val, I can grow just enough to carry you and Devon over. We'd cross in minutes without dragging everyone along." Bannock's gaze flicked to Liz, his calm demeanor holding firm. "Or we could work together on a plan that gets everyone across." He raised his voice just enough to make sure she heard. Liz rolled her eyes slightly, gesturing that she wasn't the only violator. In fact, everyone was beginning to form clusters, naturally falling into smaller conversations to brainstorm how to make the crossing. "Maybe I could cause some plants to grow into a raft," Kelly said to Kenny, who seemed to question the integrity of the vessel. "Think you could freeze the whole river?" Mac asked Tommy with a grin. Tommy shook his head, wincing slightly as he considered the toll that would take. "Freezing all of it would drain my mana. I could only cover parts, maybe just enough for us to step across if we're careful." Devon, overhearing, scoffed, crossing his arms. "Then don't bother mentioning it if you can't actually pull it off," he said flatly. Tommy's confidence wavered, but Bannock quickly stepped in with a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's a solid idea," he said, offering a small, encouraging smile. "We might be able to make it work without overdoing it on mana." Tira's mind raced with possibilities, piecing their ideas together. What if Tommy froze certain sections of the river as stepping stones? "And we could use the rope to steady ourselves as we cross," she suggested, catching Bannock's eye. Bannock's face lit up at her idea. "That's perfect, Tira." He turned to Kelly, who had been quietly working her hands through the vines on the ground, twisting them together. "Could you use your plant growth magic to lengthen the vines of Tommy's rope?" "Maybe turn them into a bridge?" Kelly nodded. "I think I can make that work," she said. As the group gathered momentum on their plan, Bannock turned to Tira, his eyes warm but curious. "What about you, Tira? You've got to have something up your sleeve, any powers you think might help." Tira's breath hitched, her thoughts scrambling as her mind quickly sifted through the implications. The truth of her abilities lingered just below the surface, but her magic, with its taboo nature and dual sensations, felt far removed from their current needs. Necromancy was complex and elusive, a magic that whispered of shadows and the forbidden exchange of life itself. She knew from experience the sharp, confusing sensation it created. Draining life brought a heady rush, while giving life drained her, leaving her feeling fragile and raw. They'd never understand, she thought, an unbidden ache settling in her chest. How could she explain that offering life left her weakened, her own body bearing the wounds she healed in others? Or that the power to take life, while unsettling, gave her a strange, euphoric clarity? It wasn't something she could share without shifting the group's trust. Finally, she offered a small shrug, feigning indifference. Nothing that's really relevant for building a bridge, she said, hoping the casual tone masked the unease beneath her words. I'll stay on standby in case something goes wrong. Bannock held her gaze a moment longer, and she thought she saw the faintest flicker of understanding. But he simply nodded, respecting her choice without pressing further, before turning back to the others. But just as they were finalizing the plan, Liz's voice cut through. I could also grow the vines, you know, she said, an edge to her tone. She held Kelly's gaze, her smirk just visible. Building a bridge is going to take a lot of mana. It sounded like Liz's barbed comment was trying to be helpful. Instead of taking offense, Kelly focused on the vines, reaching out a hand to Liz. I'm fine working with you if you're willing to lend a hand, Kelly said forgivingly. I'll handle the vines weaving if you can help with the growth. Liz's mouth twisted into a slight smirk as she reached out, a faint magical aura flowing from her hand, and without even a single sarcastic remark. Together, their powers stretched the vines into thick, sturdy ropes, weaving them into a path that crossed the murky river. Tommy stepped forward, using small bursts of his mana to freeze patches along the rope bridge. The patches served as sturdy anchors to hold the bridge in place over the water. Not bad, Liz remarked with grudging admiration, though her gaze stayed on the bridge rather than the team. Val went first, her tall frame moving steadily across the makeshift bridge, her steps sure and precise. Tira watched, noting Val's confidence as she navigated the frozen stepping stones, her gaze unwavering as if nothing would shake her. Liz and Devon followed closely behind, their movements swift and practiced, moving together in an easy rhythm. Liz's shoulders were held high, her face unreadable, while Devon wore a steely expression that matched the quiet resolve in his gaze. The rest of the group began to follow in pairs, each of them stepping carefully, finding their footing across the rope bridge. Tira found herself at the back, keeping her eyes on Bannock, who was stationed in the middle, offering quiet words of encouragement to anyone who seemed uncertain just as he did. Their presence together radiated a calm reassurance, and even with the tension hanging in the air, they seemed to ground everyone. Quite the assortment of talents and temperaments, Max's voice drifted through her mind, carrying a note of quiet amusement. I think the teamwork is coming together, Tira replied mentally, her gaze flicking between her group members as they carefully crossed. I think some people are just used to doing things on their own, she observed, her gaze lingering on Liz and Devon. But Bannock's different. I think he's trying to hold everyone together. Good insight, Max replied thoughtfully. But don't ignore your own instincts. You have a way of reading people, Tira, maybe more than you realize. She held his words close, studying the group as they made their way forward. There was an almost fragile balance among them, a mix of cautious steps, hesitant glances, and quiet determination. The weight of what was unspoken lingered in the air, and she found herself wondering if that balance would hold as they ventured further. As she followed the path forward, her mind drifted to Addie, who moved tentatively just ahead, her steps slower, her shoulders tense, her eyes glued to the dark waters below. Bannock's soft encouragement floated back to her as he continued to check on everyone, steady and calm. But halfway across, Addie's foot slipped on a patch of moss. Her arms flailed for balance, and she let out a chirping scream before her body disappeared into the river with a loud splash. Val made a subtle move to help, but Liz held her back with a firm hand. Wait, Liz murmured, her gaze calm but observant, as if watching how Addie would handle the slip. Just behind her, Mac didn't hesitate. He jumped in beside Addie, gripping her around the shoulders to pull her up, but the current surged around them both. It was stronger than he'd expected, and he struggled to keep his footing. Without missing a beat, Kenny leapt down, a shield of protective mana flaring around him. The shield deflected the current's pull just enough for the three of them to regain their footing and clamber back onto the bridge, soaked but safe. As they reached the opposite bank, Addie sat down, wincing as she cradled her leg, clearly in pain. Tira's gaze sharpened with concern as she knelt beside her friend, noticing Liz's critical gaze on Addie. Before Liz could say anything, Tira took a deep breath and reached out, gently taking Addie's injured leg. Allowing her mana to flow, Tira sent a pulse of her own life force into Addie's injury, feeling a warmth in her hand, but a pain that mirrored in her own leg. A dull ache she pushed through as she mended Addie's injury. As Addie's face relaxed, her eyes fluttered open, meeting Tira's with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Tira, thank you," she said softly, her voice touched with awe. "Lucky me, getting a healer for a roommate." Tira managed a faint smile, though her own face was tinged with the fatigue she tried to hide. The strain seeped into her bones, heavier than she'd expected. Only Bannock seemed to notice, watching her with a concerned but respectful nod, his gaze warm with silent understanding. The group began to move on, crossing the riverbank's uneven terrain. Bannock lingered a moment, looking back toward Tira, his expression unreadable yet reassuring. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Go on," she whispered, nodding. "I'll be right behind." Bannock hesitated, then gave her one last steady look before following the others, catching up with them as they ventured farther into the swamp. Left alone, Tira let out a soft, pained breath, her leg throbbing. She glanced around, taking in the details of the swamp. A rustle in the underbrush caught her eye, and she turned to see a fat, warty toad. It watched her with wide eyes frozen in place, vulnerable, as though this was part of the test. The thought lingered a moment longer than it should have. How incredibly vivid it all was, the dampness in the air, the roughness of the plants underfoot. It was easy to forget it was likely a simulation, but the professors had set all this up, knowing her abilities. How much, she wondered, had they planned for her to reveal? When Tira rejoined the group, the limp in her step was gone, her movements smooth once more. She offered Bannock a nod, catching his concerned look, and gave him a small, assuring smile as she fell into pace beside him. Her leg healed.